In the studio are Zhang. He is chief correspondent for the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily in Washington, D.C. With us from New York is Robert Hormats. He is now vice chairman of the international consulting firm Kissinger Associates. And joining us too from Boston is Katharine Moon. She is a professor of political science and chair of Asian studies at Wellesley College. And in San Diego, we are joined by Richard Heydarian. He is an assistant professor in international affairs and political science at De La Salle University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Song, I'm going to start with you because you obviously cover Chinese media. You know what Chinese media is saying ahead of US President Donald Trump's visit. What are they saying? Is it trepidation or are they looking forward to it?
I think they are very much expecting Mr. Donald Trump's visit to Asia, and especially in China, because I think since he took over the power in January this year, he and the President Xi Jinping have established a very warm, personal kind of relationship. But there are many issues coming from like two sides, this DPRK issue and trade issue and many other issues. I think China will be expecting him to have a comprehensive talk with our side and try to see what kind of solutions can we find.
Yeah, it's almost a case where you don't want to go first in this trip, do you? And Bob Hormats, he is, of course, going after Hawaii, stop in Hawaii. He's going to Japan and the Republic of Korea before going to China. Very much the focus on the DPRK's missile and nuclear program, you think?
Absolutely. I think that his goal really is to do two things. One, to demonstrate that he is working very closely with the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, to make sure that the North can't exploit differences between them, to make sure that they are not divided, there's no gaps between them, and that they have strategic cohesion in the way they deal with the North. That is going to be critically important. The other thing is not to use such belligerent language vis-a-vis the North that it causes the Japanese and the South Koreans in particular to become very nervous that the United States could provoke something with the North that would have very adverse implications for them and for the region. So I think those are his two major goals.
Yeah, Katharine Moon, do you see that there's been a sort of decline in rhetoric and more focus on policy in the last few weeks? We haven't heard Rocket Man on a suicide mission, really, and the tweets about the DPRK have got less and less. Do you feel that there's getting more coherence when it comes to White House policy when it deals with the potential denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula?
Not really. The reason I say that is because with Mr. Trump, we don't know if this silence means he's building up to something else. So one thing that I actually worry about is that this may be a really good show of diplomacy to show the world that he's trying for dialogue and for negotiations among the allies and friends like China first, but yet be ready and willing to engage in some kind of military action with North Korea. So I don't know if this is a genuine attempt at trying for peaceful resolution or a show. The other problematic aspect of his visit is that he's got too much on the plate, so to speak. He has serious issues regarding trade disputes with China, $347 billion of a trade deficit with China in the goods category, only $27.7 billion in the trade of goods with South Korea in terms of a U.S. deficit, and he's going to be attacking both countries' leaders on these issues when he needs their cooperation regarding North Korea the most.
That's a good point, and I'm glad you brought up trade. Richard Heydarian, what are the allies that he's going to visit first, do you think, Japan and then the Republic of Korea to the US, want to hear most? Obviously, we're in a sort of time when the US has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was Donald Trump's thing. He also has complained about renegotiating the free trade agreement with ROK as these DPRK tensions have been there. What does Tokyo and Seoul need to hear?
Well, in many ways, this is a mission impossible for Trump. He has to come up with strategic reassurance. You know, I've been in South Korea on in Japan a few months ago, and in Korea in particular, there is a sense of trepidation. There has been a collapse in approval of American global leadership in places like Japan and Korea. I think in the Pew Research survey, it dropped by 70%, I think, in Japan, and 50% in places like South Korea. So you have a massive drop in American soft power. So Trump really has to go there and tell them that America is still a reliable partner and that he has a coherent strategy to move forward on this issue. South Koreans in particular are very worried because they know that in an event of escalation, Seoul could be completely evaporated. So that is the kind of concern they have. And there were instances whereby President Trump over Twitter not only attacked Rex Tillerson, but also criticized President Moon Jae-in's efforts to restore diplomatic negotiations with North Korea. But the reality is that we know the only solution to the problem is dialogue. Escalation is not going to help any side. And if anything, North Korea has repeatedly called Donald Trump's bluff whenever Donald Trump threatened them with escalation. And they just went on with ballistic missile tests and nuclear tests. That's why South Koreans are actually reaching out to the Philippines, which is now the chairman of the ASEAN, to bring in the ASEAN and facilitate discussion, because the ASEAN Regional Forum is perhaps the only multilateral fora whereby North Korea can deal with the rest of the region, because the six-party talks are essentially null and void now.
Well, that's an interesting point. We could do a whole thing about the six-party talks. Sorry, Katharine Moon, did you want to say something?
Yes, just quickly. I think that the really big issues, the very important issues regarding the region, such as South Korea's desire to develop its own nuclear arsenal, to increase the payload of its conventional missiles with which they need to negotiate with the United States, the increased desire of Prime Minister Abe to transform the peace constitution of Japan into one that will allow for more military power on the part of the Japanese state. These are major game-changing issues that I know will not receive the attention needed, because Mr. Trump is going to be rather short-sighted in terms of trying to, quote, denuclearize North Korea, which is dead on arrival. That is just off the table as far as the North Koreans are concerned. Everybody who is an expert on these issues around the world knows that North Korea will not budge on the possession of nuclear weapons. So unfortunately, I'm afraid that this may be a lost chance to really think about some heavy, heavy issues affecting the East Asia region and its relationship with the United States.
So, Song, as Katharine was saying, you know, there's going to be some real ally problems before Trump gets to China. So he's gone to Japan, he's gone to the Republic of Korea in the south, and then goes to China. China in the last week or so seems to have had a rapprochement a little bit with South Korea, especially sort of seeming to have made some sort of understanding of the deployment of the THAAD ballistic missile defense, which of course was a real problem for China and created a big rift economically between the two countries. Is this all part of the pre-Trump visit, and how does this play in?
I don't think this specific action is for Mr. Trump's visit in China, but it definitely will have some impact on U.S. side. But I think China and ROK are preparing for their own bilateral communication, and especially we are hearing President Xi and President Moon may meet in Vietnam this time, and even Mr. Moon may be visiting China as a state visit by the end of this year. I think it's an important step for China to develop its own kind of relationship with ROK.
So does that warming relations, how does that affect what's going on in terms of the DPRK?
I think this issue is a little bit away from the DPRK issue itself, but definitely China and ROK have many common interests in this DPRK issue. We do not want to see the nuclear arsenal to be developed by North Korea, because we are immediately neighbors of this DPRK.
And could push against any possible military designs that the Trump administration may be entertaining jointly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of people have been saying over the last couple of days. Bob Hormats, I want to widen it out a bit, because some people have criticized the Trump strategy when it comes to Asia as a little bit ad hoc. But in the last few days, we have heard a sort of idea that Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, was talking about, which his quote is a free and open Indo-Pacific region. That sounded a bit like, to me, like the pivot to Asia. But just sort of, are they going back to the old Obama thing?
It does sound a lot like that, except that there is very little content so far that we can discern that would enable them to do that. Part of it is, and the way he phrased it, is more engagement between the United States and India. And there clearly is a lot more attention being given by Washington to India and to the South Pacific, Indonesia, and other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And that terminology has some significance. So that's one thing. The other is a key element of the pivot to Asia, and I was involved in this because I worked for Hillary Clinton as her Undersecretary for Economics, was TPP. That was seen by many not just as a trade agreement, and it was an important trade agreement that involved a wide range of countries, Japan, Vietnam, and numerous other countries in the region, to pull them together in one trade unit, but it also was seen as having very important strategic implications, demonstrating that the United States had staying power in the region. The United States was a committed leader in the region, was a committed economic partner, which would bolster and underpin political and security relationships in the area as well. Having taken that away, and not only taken it away, also criticized a bilateral deal with our major ally, South Korea, that makes it even more difficult for him to say he has a coherent policy toward Asia, because there's no coherent trade policy. And if there's no coherent trade policy, then it's awfully difficult to, trade being so important in the region, awfully difficult to have a broader set of strategic policies in the area and convince people that you're a reliable partner. If you're not reliable on a trade agreement, what are you reliable on? How do you convince them of that?
I just want to interrupt you and show live pictures, actually, we have of Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump arriving in Hawaii. That's their first stop in the Pacific. Obviously still a long way away from the first destination, Tokyo, but that is them there, coming down the steps of Air Force One into Honolulu, Hawaii. Katharine Moon, there are other countries also that we should really talk about. Vietnam was actually a signature to TPP. They took a lot of persuading, and the US has really tried to develop relations with Vietnam. That's going to be an interesting stop for President Trump, a country that may not be on his immediate radar.
Yes, before we get to Vietnam, I want to make a comment about the Indo-Pacific cooperation scheme. We need to be really clear that this is not even an idea that has come from Mr. Trump's mind or the White House or Americans. Its origin is Japan. The Japanese have wanted something like an Indo-Pacific consortium of democracies in Asia, including Japan, Australia, India as primary leaders, along with the United States.
Yes.
In order to contain China, and this is the important point, to contain China. China knows exactly what that scheme is about. So I think Mr. Trump and other leaders need to be very cautious in how they balance this idea about a surrogate, in a sense, for the TPP, but at the same time that directly is aimed at containment. It doesn't even purport to say it is really about economics. As far as Vietnam goes, for the last 30 years or so, both Vietnam and the United States have worked very hard to reconcile, to normalize, and to build the bilateral relationship, so much that we even have military cooperation, military exercises that go on. This is unheard of given our history during the war. So I think that Mr. Trump would win some kudos in a country that is not as big a player in East Asia if he were able to continue that track of cooperation with Vietnam.
I also want to talk about the Philippines. Richard Heydarian, you know quite a bit about the Philippines. There's been a sort of weird up and down relationship between the United States and the Philippines with President Duterte and President Trump. He's now decided also to stay on an extra day for the key summit there as well. Is that going to help, or does it need a lot more than that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think of all the countries that Trump is going to visit, the one that could get a lot of attention and there could be some semblance of a deliverable is in the Philippines. Because as I predicted last year when Donald Trump won, there's going to be a massive shift or recovery in Philippine-US relationship. And that's precisely because if you look at the psychology of Rodrigo Duterte and the kind of populism that he represents, it almost perfectly syncs with that of Donald Trump. So in many ways, you have a populist international going on between those two leaders. And Duterte, since the victory of Donald Trump, has never said anything negative whatsoever against the executive branch of the United States. He had an absolutely cordial discussion with Rex Tillerson during the ASEAN Regional Forum and is looking forward to a convivial hobnob with Donald Trump. In fact, I'm willing to bet that Donald Trump and Duterte are going to have a selfie, and most likely there's going to be a Duterte fist there. That is going to be interpreted differently in different quarters of the world. Duterte wants to show that he's now a regional power broker, that he's on good terms with all major powers, not only Xi Jinping and Putin, but also Trump is on his side. And he wants to use that to say to the opposition in the Philippines that there's no chance of you unseating me. I have the support of all the big boys. Trump is going to go there and say Obama was incompetent. He alienated the Philippines, pushed Duterte into China's embrace. And guess what? I'm so fantastic. I'm going to win back the Philippines. So both of them have a reason to come strong together and to project the world that U.S.-Philippine relationship is strong. More strategically speaking, of course, the threat of the ISIS in the Philippines is still there, even if Marawi has been liberated. So the two sides are going to also talk about counter-terror cooperation.
Yes.
Where things could get a little bit interesting is on the South China Sea issue and then China. And I'm not sure that the two countries are on the same board on that issue because Duterte is determined to normalize and to improve Philippine relations with China. And I'm not sure how Trump is going to feel about that.
That's a great segue into Song, your next question. I was going to ask about that in terms of the South China Sea, because the Trump administration seemed to, at the beginning, have a very different view of the South China Sea, not as make it such a hot button issue. But we have seen the resumption of what the Americans call freedom of navigation operations in and around Chinese claimed territory there. Is that going to be a major sticking point in Beijing, considering Manila wants to downplay it?
I think this issue will not be a very, very controversial issue between Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi. And although Defense Secretary Mr. Mattis had a very harsh talk in Singapore a few months ago, and also USA had 4 at least freedom of navigation actions in the last a few months. But for China, this issue is not like DPRK issue. On DPRK issue, we have a lot of common interest. But in South China Sea, China believes we are doing our level best, try to reconcile with the local friends, local claimants, especially Philippines, Vietnam, and other issues. And also we are moving to a new kind of code of conduct about the South China Sea issue. And even we are proposing to have joint exploration of this energy, especially oil in the South China Sea. So we don't think there are a lot of issues to be discussed, but we can discuss how to avoid a kind of contingency or kind of risk between the two military forces in South China Sea, between US and China. But besides this, I don't think there are many other issues China will be happy to talk. And also, at this moment, the situation in South China Sea is relatively peaceful, and I don't think there are a lot of kind of urgency for U.S. President to talk about this issue.
Yeah, interesting. Bob Hormats, what do you think in terms of the US and China when it comes to sticking points like the South China Sea, like the East China Sea? Do you think allies of the US will try and get Washington to raise that while it's in the region? Or do you think the Trump administration will be less forceful than, say, the Obama administration was?
It's hard to say. I do not think it's going to turn out to be a major issue in the discussions. I think the president will talk about the freedom of navigation and particularly commercial navigation and probably some elements of it. But this comes up in virtually all US-China meetings. I think for the president, one of the key points is going to, and we go back to this issue of trade. I think he is going to have to figure out what he wants to say about trade. Does he want to take a tough position on trade, or hoping that the Chinese will work with him on the issue of the nuclear problems in the Korean Peninsula. Is he going to back off on trade? There's a lot of populist pressure in the U.S., particularly populist pressure generated by his own campaign on trade issues vis-a-vis China and other countries with which the United States has a big bilateral trade deficit. On the other hand, if he wants to work with the Chinese on Korea, he's going to have to mute some of those things. He's going to have to be much less strident than he was during the campaign and try to work on some of these issues. The thing is also the Chinese now have a sense of self-confidence. They've had it for a long time, but particularly now after the 19th Party Congress. Yeah. And they're not going to get pushed around by the United States. Trump sees himself as a tough negotiator, and if he wants to be tough on trade, then he might do it. It's very hard to predict what he'll do at any given point. But he's going to have to realize China now sees itself as a major player on trade. China's a centerpiece of a major regional negotiation on trade, and he's going to find it very hard to get his way on the big trade issues. He can talk about them, but seeing a major shift in U.S.-China trade relations across the board is going to be very difficult to do. The Chinese have a sense of self-confidence. Trump may be a tough talker and a negotiator, but China's not going to be pushed around by him. I'm glad you brought up the 19th Party Congress. I was actually in Beijing for a couple of weeks there, and I think you're absolutely right, this sort of confidence, and I want to widen it out in the last couple of minutes. Katharine Moon, you know, we've seen perhaps a decline in traditional U.S. leadership in the region in terms of the backing off of TPP, other things as well. It seems, you know, a vacuum is always filled by someone. And China's taking a much more bigger regional role, as we know, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I could go on and on and on. Is this a tipping point moment for Donald Trump in the U.S.?
I don't know about a tipping point moment for Donald Trump, but this is definitely not a tipping point moment for the United States. The United States is greater than one man, even if he occupies the White House. And the Asian allies, especially South Korea and Japan, they do want to have a good relationship with China for a variety of reasons. Economic. South Korea, because of the THAAD dispute with China, has lost approximately about $12 billion in the last year or so of business with China. So they have their own economic gripes with China. But they will try to improve relations with China. The Southeast Asian neighbors also, they're wary of China, but they want to be friends with China and to do trade with China. And they want to make sure that they can play both of the superpowers off each other. They're hedging their bets like good people who pursue their national interests. This is what governments do. Okay. And I think it would be a mistake for the United States to label these countries as leaning toward China or not leaning toward China, and put them in unrealistic and artificial boxes. Okay. One other thing is that the Asian countries are very much in the same camp when it comes with certain types of values about international norms, international laws, especially South Korea and Japan. And these are not issues that China is particularly strong on. And so for the time being, I think the U.S. is in fine shape.
Well, we'll wait and see after this trip. Donald Trump, as the U.S. president, has a way of surprising us when he makes these trips. We'll wait and see. Thanks so much for everyone. Katharine Moon, Zhang here in the studio, Bob Hormats and Richard Heydarian, thanks so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, filling in for Anna Naidu. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.